My name is Darryn, and you are listening to the Dungeon Speak podcast.
The sun was high over the waters of the coasts. Boats and merchants bustled in the docks, moving out, coming in, loading and unloading. Throughout the village, elves carried wares and freight through stalls and sand. Boxes were brought through the beachside village, down a road, downwards into an alcove in the beach wall, leading further down into the city. Alongside the top of the wall, looking over the dockside village, was a young Celtra. He sat on a stump with a small pile of parts, gears, and screws. On a makeshift bench made of rock and wood from a small crate, sitting on the table was a small, tiny machine. Celtra looked down at the steadily increasing number of squirrels. He gave them a brief smile before turning back to the small machine, crudely recreated in their image. Save two rotary propellers poking out of the top. Giving the tiny machine one final screw, he lifted it up with a proud smile. The young Celtra gave the propellers a few experimental turns, letting the flying machine hover above his hands. He took a few deep breaths, preparing himself for the flight before finally letting it go. The small, drone-like machine took off, flying towards the docks. Celtra sat on the beach wall, looking over the village as his machine made its way. A strong sea breeze blew by, almost knocking over the very small child. He caught himself, squinting at the reflection of the sun in the ocean. He almost didn't notice the strong wind blew the machine back into the trees along the wall. He stood up as quickly as he could, rushing into the woods. He followed the ear-piercing noise of the squirrels' startled screams. Celtra rubbed his eyes from the sting of the sun, attempting to clear his sight, relying mostly on his ears to find the site of the landing of his possibly crashed drone. Suddenly, his heart dropped with the rest of him. Rocks and debris tumbled with him as he sank into the ground. Falling into the darkness. His heart rate skyrocketed as his descent was slowed before suddenly springing upwards. But he was still suspended in the air. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he noticed he was in a familiar location, the silk farm. His heart raced as spiders big and small began to gather around him. He struggled to pull himself free, but his small frame wasn't nearly strong enough to break the grip of the webs. As the spiders crowded him, his vision began to become obscured. He could feel the tiny legs of the spiders climb around him as his limbs became bound to his sides. Within minutes, his vision went black as he was fully bundled, restrained inside of a web cocoon. The sound of hollering squirrels in the distance. He could feel himself be flipped upside down before he eventually passed out. There was no telling how long he was unconscious. He didn't expect to not be eaten, but he blinked his eyes in the light of the lamps of the silk harvesting area. His eyes adjusted, looking up at the face of his mother. She was one of the prominent silk weavers of the community, having come into the spider den, hearing the shrieking of the squirrels coming into the cave. She looked down on Celtra with a comforting smile, a look of concern on her face. She brushed the remainder of the webs from his face, the cocoon still wrapped around his lower torso, but it was loosened enough for him to breathe better. The Celtra's breathing quickened before he finally broke down, clutching onto his mother. Celtra sat in his room, tinkering with parts and pieces. Sitting on shelves and hanging from the ceiling were machines of various levels of completion. A small cylindrical one-eyed contraption skittered across the floor. It reached out one of its clawed feet, holding a towel. The young drow accepted the towel, using it to wipe his forehead. He tucked his head back into the square-shaped device he was working on. After a few more turns of his wrench, he took a step back, reaching out to the device. Grabbing a handle on the side of the machine, he pulled up a stand on top of the device. There were spokes around the edges of the hollow stand. Celtra looked over his finished machine, adding the final touch, a bar with grooves in it to attach to the sides. The top of the machine had thin, needle-like arms that moved seemingly independently. Celtra winced at their appearance momentarily before closing the device back. Celtra rolled the device out of his room and snuck through the halls of his home. After slipping through the halls, he unlocked the door to a large room. His mom usually kept it locked, but he had grown pretty good at getting into locks. The mechanics of the locks and the tools needed to get around them were similar to working with smaller sections of machines. Inside of this room were shelves filled with rolls of unworked spider silk. Celtra took one of the spools and set it up on the device. He looked over the spool for a long time, trying to remember how his mom had attached the threads to her regular looms. Looking over towards it, he began to mimic what it looked like when she had done it. After some trial and error, he felt like he got it down. Now all that was left was to test it. The machine sprang to life as he turned it on, the bar sliding up and down along the outer edges of the frame, while the slender arms worked the threads into fabric, at least at first. Before long, the bar jammed and the arms started to sputter and creak. Celtra panicked, waving his arms around, trying to get the machine to stop before his mom heard. Unfortunately, it was too late. As he pulled out his wrench to stop the machine, he could feel the presence of someone standing behind him. He looked behind him to see his mom looming over him. She had a disappointed look on her face, since Celtra knew not to mess around in the silk room. However, she looked around and saw the mess he had made, then down at the contraption he had built. Her expression shifted slightly from stern disappointment to slightly less stern understanding. He was still in trouble for breaking into the room, but now she could see why. She took him aside, pulling up a chair and sitting him down in front of his new mechanical loom. At first he thought he was in trouble, but he wasn't, at least at the moment. Taking his hands in hers, she began to untangle all of the twisted threads and help him remove the jammed machinery. Once everything was set up properly, she showed him how it was supposed to work, working the bar along the frame as she wove the spider silk threads, until eventually they had completed a fine purple scarf. His mom knelt down in front of him, wrapping the scarf around his neck. She kissed him on the forehead before finally telling him to clean up his mess.
So I want you to go on an expedition with me, a fun adventure up the mind. I want you to picture, if you will, a desert, and stretching out not far away is a coastline with an expanse of water. There's nothing else around but sand, and in the middle of this lump of sand is a small village set in an oasis. There are small groups of trees, mostly bare, with an average height of around 20 to 30 feet, and a small pool of water. At the edge of this small oasis is a caravan of wagons. There are not many of the individuals in this caravan. A small, light gray skinned elf with white pupils and purple markings all over his arms is finishing loading the last wagon. His face expresses some kind of difficulty getting a bag up into the back of this wagon, and a slightly older elf approaches to assist. This red-eyed, dark blue-skinned elf smiles and helps hoist the last of the bags up into the caravan. Despite the brass-decorated armor that this elf is wearing, you can see that he has a good bit of muscle density to him. He moves his long white hair aside and makes his way to the front of the wagons as they all start to move through this desert. With some heap of silver or some kind of metal at the front of these wagons, but no horses, oxen, or animals of any kind. It seems like a heap of armor moving on its own and pulling these wagons. We get a broader view as we zoom out of the scene to see the wagon slowly starting to move towards a mountain far in the distance. You can just see a thick wilderness at the base of this mountain, but you can tell it's a very long ways away. It would take at least weeks to get there, if not longer. We see the inside of these wagons and see excavators and hired swords smiling at each other as time passes and talking indistinctively, a friendly familiarity about them. Then the wagons stop. Confused, everyone exits the wagons, and before them lies a cut in the ground, broken rocks, dirt, and hanging grass dropping into this chasm. The excavators start getting out tools, and everyone starts unloading pack wagons as they look to break down the rocks or build some kind of crossing. Suddenly, this light gray-skinned elf stops. He turns back to this chasm, and his white pupils go wide as two large, dirty, brass-looking legs sprout out of the chasm. Coming up as one limb and spreading as dirt and rocks fly, a loud reverberating noise fills the air as some kind of creature, not a creature, some kind of brass thing explodes from the chasm. Whirring noise is coming from twirling and bladed mouths. It hovers over the caravan, easily 40 feet high. We move in once again to see the light gray-skinned elf. We see his wide eyes, and then we fade to black. Birds swarm away overhead, the sun starts to shine through, and groans and yells of names can be heard as smoke is clearing from a giant beast that has burrowed its way through rocks just minutes before. Over a landscape with rocks and a canyon, people seem to be scurrying about. A mechanical beast lays on the ground in ruins, and caravanners recover from the battle that had ended moments ago. Elves all around were repairing equipment, starting to build that bridge they had originally intended on, and they were making sure their carts were in working condition. All were recovering in one way or another, all except one elf. In the middle of this mechanical beast and wreckage was a gray-skinned elf, young, white hair, white pupils, and purple markings. Celtra was too curious to sit and recover. He wanted answers that no one else seemed to be asking. Celtra dumped a massive pile of scrap parts and pieces down in the middle of the caravan's camp and set to work rummaging through it. Watching him with curiosity was the strong-looking, dark, gray elf that had helped him lift luggage back into the caravan previously. Rudger stops filing dents out of his longsword and watches Celtra. Where did all of this come from? Earlier today you could barely get luggage in the back. Now you can hold machine parts?
It isn't that heavy if you drag it around. It's different when you gotta lift it.
Celtra began pulling the scrap heap. Taking wires and arcane crystals from the carcass of the machine, he sets down 2 piles and put the guts on the machine in one pile and the outer shell in another. What are you doing with all that junk anyway?
Sorting out what I should keep. Celtra rifles through a few of the things and tinkers with and kind of like attaches parts and pieces to his crossbow. It's a lot, sure, but you never know what might be useful later.
Anything you can do about the damage to the caravan? It took a heavy hit from that thing you're taking apart. Celtra looks carefully over the pieces he set aside and then over towards the damaged caravan. The machine pulling the caravan is toppled over, having suffered severe damage. Arcs of arcane energy surged from it as it twitched in the sand.
I could probably do something about that. There's more than enough stuff lying around here. Probably take some of these parts and fix it up, and then Celtra just starts to trail off to himself as he gets up and brushes himself off and just kind of like starts taking like shells and metal bits from the machine over towards the wreckage, or over towards the machines that were pulling the cart.
He pulls out a wrench and a screwdriver set and sets to work repairing the damage to the machine. Then all goes dark as he just sits there, tinkering and fixing what the world knows of machinery.
The caravan proceeded forward through rough sands and rocky terrain, slowly yielding to grass and loose dirt. Leaving the desert behind, the caravan soon found itself in the plains of Cerul. Fields of blue-green grass stretched out as far as the eyes could see, dotted periodically by tall trees of varying kinds. Bushes and flora of various kinds filled the countryside, though they all shared the same telltale signs of the plant lives of Cerul. The leaves and grass were all distant shades of bluish-green and bore the soft glow of blue circuitry patterns woven into the makeup of the plants in much the same way as the circuits in the skin of the people of this land. Celtra had never been this far outside of his home. He had seen trees and grass in small amounts in the oasis they had grown up in, but never this much. There had never been forest or fields. He stared out the window, absent-mindedly writing notes about what he was seeing. As far as he could see, it was only fields. He wasn't sure where the site they were supposed to be exploring was, but the trip was taking him further north than he had ever been. He even wondered if he'd get to see the snow stuff that some of the other guys had been talking about. But as far as he could tell, it was too warm for that. Celtra shifted his attention from staring out the window back to what he was doing. He made off with a bunch of Loot's magic books to look over, taking notes of all the research she had managed to find to herself. Setting aside his personal notebook, he began to take notes in his own book of magic. He wasn't quite as skilled in the arcane, but he was always fascinated by it. Loot had allowed him to borrow her books while they traveled so he could get some practice in. At this point in the day, many of the other passengers were asleep. Celtra had opted to stay awake and had been awake for the past couple of days, taken to getting as much study and practice as he could. His circuits glowed faintly as he exercised some of the more basic spells within the books. While he was eager to learn, he knew from experience with mechanics that diving too deeply into advanced stuff could spell disaster. He was apparently lucky he could read this stuff at all, slow and steady. As he became more and more absorbed in the studying, he was suddenly shaken by the vibrating of the room around him. His practice machines toppled as the room shook. The shaking, though noticeable, wasn't violent. Celtra glanced out the window to see, in the slowly fading daylight, a massive mechanical beast on the horizon. Though faint, the creature was clearly visible in the trees. It was bulky, standing several stories and covered in armor plating. What parts weren't covered appeared to have some sinew wires, all glowing faintly with red light. Red circuitry patterns snaked its way along its body, tracing along the carapace until they converged on a singular crystal-like eye. It sported long horns and a shell made of shimmering panels of unknown material. Its tail was thick, segmented, and blocky, bearing a spike at the fifth and final segment. The machine wandered through the trees, each step of its 4 legs causing the ground to shake. It moved slowly, almost careful not to tear any of them down, as it searched for something only it was aware of. Beneath it, and through the trees, other mechanical creatures, smaller and less bulky, scurried away from the path of this behemoth machine. Stay a while and listen.
The caravan arrived in the woodlands of an ancient city. The city was large and the buildings were still intact enough to discern what they once looked like. Large spires rising into the air, decorated with intricate carvings and patterns. The spires had chunks missing, diminishing their once former glory, but still being a spectacle nonetheless. Rubble from the structures lay scattered across the ground. Whole sides of buildings and rooftops littered the streets. Once great fountains and statues lay partially crumbled. After an unknown amount of years, leaves, trees, vines, and other vegetation have grown through the cracks of streets, buildings, and completely taken over some of the spires. Throughout the ancient city, remains of machines lay in varying states of disrepair. Some hung off or out of buildings, while others lay strewn about on the ground below. Extended claws, tendril-like appendages, plates of metal, and frayed exposed wire decorated many of these machines, most of them towering over the caravan, all of them dwarfing the elven parties exploring the city. The caravan travels through the overgrown wreckage for as long as it can before the debris and machines make the trek too difficult, forcing them to disembark. The caravan parked in what used to be the city square, and the group disembarked. Celtra teamed up with Lute and Rutger to explore the metropolis. They separated from the rest of the group, exploring through the buildings. As the 3 of them explored the city, they were careful not to disturb any of the machines. Curious as he may have been, Celtra was aware that many of the gnarly-looking machines were still intact, meaning it was possible for them to spring back to life if they weren't careful. While the remains of these buildings were mostly unharmed, save for the wear of time, other than the furniture, art, and other comforts, there were no signs of anything in the city that hinted at the sort of people that lived there once before. Information could be gathered based on what was left behind, but there was no telling how long this once sprawling and presumably bustling, crowded city had been completely void of life. As they traveled, Rutger noticed that there were fresher sets of footprints. He couldn't tell how long they'd been there, but he knew they couldn't belong to anyone in the caravan. He stayed on alert, suspicious, but trying not to be paranoid. As they traveled, the tracks faded away. The three of them eventually came across a building boarded by a blast door. The door was slated down the length of it, standing over a story in height and locked in place. Tracing up the sides of the door and along the narrow two-story building are gently pulsing blue circuitry patterns culminating in eye-like points. Rutger and Lute made way for Celtra to see if he could do something about the door. They could try and brute force their way through, but Celtra's role in the mission was to deal with the mechanical aspects. He pulled out a bag of tools and arcane objects and made his way to a standing pedestal with a panel at the side of the door. After some time, Lute began to worry. Lute said it's weird that no one has met up with them yet. This place is big, but not that big. So Rutger said, Celtra, how much longer on that door? Celtra? Celtra? Celtra was lost in his work. Having been denied on his last few tries to get the door open, this time he'd get it for sure. Before he could try to get this new configuration, Lute tackled him to the ground as a net flew overhead. Behind them, outside of the building's overhang, was a small party of elves, all of them bearing yellow circuitry patterns. They wore light armor and had weapons drawn. The three of them were outnumbered, but it didn't look like the raiders were out to kill them. It was possible they could fight their way out. If they made it back to the caravan, they could escape.
The plan of escape didn't work out as intended, or at all for that matter. Celtra sat in the back of the wagon, chained by his hands in a cell. He wasn't sure about what happened to the others. All he knew was that he was alone. How long he had been alone, he wasn't sure. Every once in a while, the raiding party would toss him scraps to eat, but he couldn't see outside. It was dark, not that it affected his vision, but he couldn't see the light, so he was unsure of the passage of time. He could tell by the shift in temperatures that they were nowhere near the excavation site anymore. It was hot, humid, the bars burned when he leaned up against them. The whole situation made being locked up the way he was far more uncomfortable. His complaints would only fall on deaf ears. He had learned that by now. The travel had become far rougher. While the heat and humidity was still unbearable, the bars of the cell had cooled down fairly substantially. He was able to lean against them, still not great as the rough terrain meant the bars continually banged against his face. After a few minutes of this, he decided it best to just sit straight. He was tired. His sleep had been difficult during the travel, if he got any at all. He had tried to find any means of escape, tools or scraps he could use to make something, but they were careful to keep anything useful far outside of his reach. He was stuck to the whims of his captors. After what felt like weeks of travel, the wagon finally stopped. He could hear muffled conversation, an exchange of some kind, but he couldn't make out what. The wagon proceeded forward for a few minutes before stopping once more. The back door of the wagon rattled and swung open. A pair of large, heavy-set southlings grabbed the cage and flung it onto the ground. Celtra winced as the sudden shift and slamming caught his right hand under the cell floor, nearly crushing his hand against the ground. He snatched it back as quickly as he could before taking in his surroundings. He was in a forest, a dense rainforest as far as he could tell. The area he was in was cleared. Ancient buildings had been re-established and fortified with wood, creating hybrid wood and metal structures. High walls bordered the clearing, which had clearly been set up as a camp. Taking in the scene, Celtra noticed that there were two distinct groups, not by patterns or complexion, but by attire. The Southlings, who clearly ran the camp, being the only ones with weapons, armor, and equipment in the camp. Then there was everyone else. They wore rags and chains around their ankles. Most were put to work fortifying buildings or the wall, but there was a small subset of these captives that appeared to have a different task. At the center of the camp was a high wall surrounded by scaffolding and excavation equipment. It was hard to make out, but the equipment appeared to surround what looked like an ancient temple. From the cleared-away rubble, Celtra could see a massive metallic being within. He wasn't sure exactly what it was, but he had heard of things like this. From the patterns decorating the outside and the lens reflecting in the small amounts of sunlight, he could tell that this was some sort of weapon.
He wasn't aware of how long he had been working. His sense of time had left him on the road. However, it was clear why they wanted him. There was a large group of captives from all over Cerule working on building up this fortress, but there was a smaller niche dedicated to uncovering this large machine, presumably with the purpose of turning it on. His captors were unclear about what it was, and Celtra had personally never seen or heard of anything like this. On its own, it was the size of a large building, encased in a closed-off temple the encampment clearly didn't know how to properly get into. Thick tentacle-like appendages stretched out from it, ending in a point. There were panels all across what was exposed of the chassis. These panels seemed to house weapons, at least from what Celtra could deduce. He wasn't sure how long he had been awake and working on this machine. Normally, this wouldn't be a problem for him, but this was entirely involuntary and under duress. He wasn't alone. The captors had them bound up in groups to keep them from escaping and easier to manage. Celtra himself was chained by the ankles to two elves he had never run into before. One had tanned skin with yellow patterns, the other was slightly more pale, but not gray like him, with green circuits. They had introduced themselves as Razmi and Ajna. The three of them knew different things about the machines, which is why they were put together. After weeks of digging and tinkering, the three of them reached a large panel in the depths of the temple. Celtra placed his hand on the panel to brace himself. The circuits on his body began to glow. The other two followed suit, their circuits glowing as well. The panel hissed, sinking into the chassis and sliding off the side to reveal a large cavernous space inside of the machine. It was surprisingly vacant, as if designed for people to operate inside of it. There was little in the way of controls, but there were plenty of areas where it was clear some sort of operator was supposed to work within. Looking around, the three of them could tell this is where they'd be staying for the foreseeable future.
Celtra awoke in the cold, metallic floor in the bowels of the machine. It had been weeks since he was placed inside with Razmi and Ajna. The space was cramped and uncomfortable, but they were kept in there day in and day out, not allowed to leave, barely allowed to eat or sleep. The three of them had been tasked with figuring out how to get it up and running. Again. So far, they had made little progress. The machine was ancient and difficult to read. It was hard to say what had shut it down in the first place, much less what was keeping it down now. Despite the weeks making no progress, their captives didn't seem intent on allowing the three of them to leave. While they didn't interfere much with them inside, they were sure to make certain they couldn't leave. Celtra rose from his uncomfortable sleeping position to see Ajna fiddling away with the chains, keeping them together. Despite their insistence that unchaining them would help them work better, they were routinely denied, a fact Ajna was not pleased about. She had figured a way to undo them, but they were sure to put them back on before they were inspected. After being released, Celtra made his way to a console within the machine. It had a soft, glowing light and several of what appeared to be buttons, but they were flush to the console itself. They weren't sure how to get everything to work, but Razmi was able to figure some of the language after the time they had spent. It was something none of them had seen before, but she had managed to pick out words, useful ones that would let them figure out what this machine at least was. It was, in fact, an old war machine, though it was better to call it a mechanical monster. It didn't appear to have a master, similar to the machines that roam the land now, but it also seemed that its purpose was much more sinister. Celtra crouched down in front of the console and started to undo the front panel, making his way into the wires and guts of the monster. He eventually reached a conglomeration of wires and cords. He had been there before, evidence of this being a small device connected to the tangle of cords. After some back and forth with the ladies, he had concluded that what they needed was a power source, a real one, if they were going to get this thing up and running. They weren't even sure if they should, but they were limited on options. They could either do this, or die and their captives would just find someone else. Celtra sighed, taking a cord in hand and linking it to the power system he'd made. It wasn't much, yet, but it was enough to get the power on within the machine. In the space Ajna and Razmi were in, the lights flickered before filling the room with dim light. The console Razmi stood in front of sputtered to life, a holographic panel flickering intermittently before her. There was power, but only enough for them to notice, for now. The internal mechanisms of the machine came to life. Though it had power, it didn't have enough to function properly. The three elves were confined to the inside of the behemoth until they could provide it with the power it needed. There were cells removed from the machine, cores and connective wires that were clearly missing, that the three of them were set at work replacing and repairing. It was at the same time exciting to be working on an ancient piece of technology like this, but also terrible, knowing the purpose of such a contraption. It still wasn't clear to what end the captors desired to use the machine, but given their current situation, what was clear was that it couldn't be good. With little choice but to do as they were forced to do, they had devised what could be a solution to their predicament. It was unanimous amongst the trio that this machine was never to be used. As fascinating as they all found it, they were all aware that once it was up and running, the end result would be catastrophic. They worked tirelessly to put together not only the components of the machine, but their plan. The weapon was large, massive. It would not only require a massive amount of energy to move, but should anything go wrong, it would cease functionality. It, by its design, needed everything to function properly. That was how they would solve their problem. With their knowledge of the components and inner workings of the device, they could find a way to choke the energy, causing it to build up. The results would be destructive. How much so, they weren't sure. But it had to be better than the alternative. All that they had to ensure was that the group responsible for capturing them never found out about this. It had to be done secretly. They would only have one chance. The day had arrived. The plan was in place. All they had to do was enact it. Their captors had separated them, allowing them the space to work. The group had told them that the machine was near complete. All it would take was for one of them to be on the inside to be sure the power core they created was functioning properly. Another would need to activate it, and the third would need to be on the ground monitoring. The captors, though skeptical, allowed it. Razmi stood with the crowd, looking up towards the top rafters as Celtra prepared to activate the machine. He was doing his best to contain his nerves. He didn't want to give anything away. The machine was inspected beforehand to ensure that there were no obvious risks of sabotage, and everything looked to be in working order. With that established, they were given their suggestions. Ajna was on the inside, monitoring the battery they had created. She was guarded as well to make sure that she didn't try anything during the test. Their nerves were all shot, fearing that any of them could give away the plan and stop the test. The crowd had finished gathering. The warband that had captured them was preparing to witness the rise of an ancient machine that would grant them more power in their future conquests. As far as any of them knew, it would make them unstoppable. The startup was loud. Old gears creaked, electricity surged, metal bowed and strained as the machine was given life. It rose from its resting position slowly. This part was by design. Celtra and the others needed to ensure that it gave the appearance of proper functionality. After the initial demonstration of movement, it was time to enact the plan. The warband wanted a war machine, and as such, they needed proper weapons functionality. Set up at a distance was a hanging cage containing the survivors of a rival camp. The center of the machine opened up. The light in its center began glowing, a loud whirring noise ringing out amongst the camp, pausing the work around it. In his shock, one of the guards bumped Razmi, causing a component to fall out of her clothes. He looked down at it, then back at the machine. He pinned Razmi to the ground before shouting to the rest of the group that there might be something wrong with the machine, but it was too late. Inside of the machine's core, Ajna had been dropped to the ground. The surge of magic and electricity filling the room lashed out indiscriminately, killing the captors and sending her spiraling to the wall. She looked up towards the surging power core, a faint smile on her face as it pulsed with green and blue energy. From the top, the guards watching over Celtra could hear the commotion. They looked down towards the source, seeing one of their compatriots pinning Razmi down and waving a part in the air. They looked back at Celtra. As they made to stop him, Celtra reached out his hand, taking a deep breath. His mind flashed briefly to thoughts of his home, the beach, his community, his mother. He wondered if she'd be proud of him. A sharp pain shot through his back as he could feel crossbow bolts enter his skin. He wasn't worried. It would be over soon. Before they could reach him to stop him, he pushed the firing mechanism. The battery within the heart of the machine raged, energy surging and expanding rapidly, first filling the inside before expanding to the rest of the machine and beyond. There was a bright flash of light. Celtra felt nothing. The end.
Darryn, tell him that joke you know.
What's the difference between a...
Never gonna give you up, never gonna let you down, never gonna run around and desert you.
and a...
Radio edit.
Darryn, tell a different joke.